In 1802, on the island of Guadeloupe, a coalition of black citizens and rebel colonial soldiers became an armed resistance of freedom fighters against the French leader, Napoleon Bonaparte. The freedom fighters' glorious action was inspired by their oath, to live free or die. Napoleon's intention was to defy the French Revolution's 1794 mandate to abolish slavery in the French Empire colonies. Napoleon's betrayal of the Revolution's ideals of liberty and equality was enforced by his full military power, in the attempts to retake control of several French Empire islands in the Caribbean area, and re-establish slave plantations and enforce his dictatorship policies. Although Guadeloupe's freedom fighters were brutally defeated, the entire saga literally ended in a big bang that exploded in the faces of the new French consulate's tyranny. The small Caribbean islands of Guadeloupe were first discovered by Europeans in 1493, during the Spanish exploration voyages of Christopher Columbus. The French took over the island in 1635 and decimated the local indigenous Indian population within a few years, through extermination and ethnic cleansing. In the mid-1600s, sugarcane crops were started on Guadeloupe. French and Dutch settlers arrived in larger numbers, and the first African slaves were brought in. On two of the islands, the Caribbean Indians fought back and in 2 episodes, massacred European settlers. For the next 100 years, many events take place, including a failed slave rebellion, and European wars that resulted in Guadeloupe's control exchanging between France and finally Britain. In 1759, Britain imported 18,000 slaves to the island. In 1763, Guadeloupe was handed over back to France, whereupon the crop production of coffee, cocoa, and molasses had expanded, as did the slave population. By 1787, the population of Guadeloupe numbers 14,000 Europeans and 73,000 slaves. With the French Revolution taking control of power in France, their dramatic new policies affected all of their French Empire overseas colonies. In February of 1794, the Revolution's French Convention abolished slavery. However, this policy was not implemented right away by the powerful French plantocracies who were far from the homeland's control. In April of 1794, the Revolution sent a French Republican fleet to Guadeloupe to enforce their authority over the old regime, as well as retake parts of Guadeloupe that the British Navy had seized. Many French royalists fled the island, and for good reason. One of the Republicans' commissioners, Victor Hughes, carried out the orders to abolish slavery. He was already well known for fully racially integrating the Republic's colonial regiments. Hughes eradicated counter-revolutionaries from the island, even bringing a guillotine from France. Hughes' troops captured 1,200 royalists. The Republicans set up their guillotine, which was used to execute 27 royalist soldiers taken prisoner in battles. In 1798, Hughes was recalled to France upon protests from the United States about his brutal methods against the royalists, and favorable treatment to the black population. The black were now free citizens living in the new Guadeloupe. Following Napoleon's seizure of power in France, in 1799, French foreign policy for France's Caribbean colonies and their black populations took a dramatic turn for the worse. The new French consulate made changes in its constitution that redefined the status of French overseas possessions, to be locally ruled by new special laws. Guadeloupe no longer had representation in the French National Assembly. In 1801, Napoleon, now the first consul and dictator of France, made new rules for Guadeloupe, which was to be implemented by a new commissioner from France, Commissioner Lacrosse, accompanied by his aide-de-camp, Louis Delgris, who was a mulatto. When Napoleon's commissioner arrived in May of 1801, his attempt to establish his sole leadership of the island created a hostile reaction from the local Guadeloupe garrison, which was mostly black and mulatto colonial troops of France. La Crosse seized command from the high-ranking mulatto garrison officer Malgloire Paillage. Opponents to La Crosse are arrested, imprisoned, and threatened with death. More ominously, La Crosse allows former French slave owners to return back from their refuge with the British in 1794. However, by November of 1801, the ousted mulatto commander Paillage forced La Crosse to be removed from power, spared him from execution, and sent him to the nearby island of Dominica. In January of 1802, the former staff officer of La Crosse, Louis Delgray, was appointed the commander of Guadeloupe's army. Paillage became the head of the local Provisional Council of Government, intending to calm the tensions among all sides. The leaders of Guadeloupe still considered themselves and their fellow citizens and soldiers to be subjects of France. But Napoleon regarded them as rebels against his authority. In April of 1802, determined to restore full control of Guadeloupe, he sent an invasion force consisting of a fleet of over 24 ships, and 3,500 soldiers. This small army was commanded by General Antoine Richepunce, and it landed in Guadeloupe at the port of Pointe-à-Pitre, on the 6th of May, and was greeted by council leader Paillage and the locals. But the warm reception was short-lived. The French show of military force roused fears and rumors of Napoleon planning to re-establish slavery. The population and army of Guadeloupe began to choose sides, to either fight or comply. Paillage remained loyal to General Richepunce. But at night, 200 black rebel soldiers and officers secretly left their post at Port Liberty. On the 8th of May, the French seized 700 black colonial soldiers and imprisoned them in the cargo holds of the ships of the French fleet. Guadeloupe's rebels and citizens became convinced that slavery plans for them were being prepared by the French. When a detachment of French troops led by Captain Rougier was sent to take over Fort de la Victoire, Joseph Ignace, its black colonial battalion garrison commander, killed the French captain and led his colored soldiers away to join the rebels.
On May 10, Louis Delgray published a rousing declaration, proclaiming freedom and defiance against the re-establishment of slavery. The proclamation started with the haunting words, "To the entire universe, the last cry of innocence and despair." It ended with the words, "Live free, or die." That day, General Richepunce began the conflict when he launched his French troops in an amphibious attack against the rebels, which resulted in heavy losses on both sides. However, the black and mulatto rebels initially forced the French to withdraw. On May 11th, a rebel commander, Telemaque, was killed when his rebel force was defeated by a French breakout attack at the Rivière des Pères. In the next days, the rebel freedom fighters led chiefly by Delgray and Ignace, boldly attacked the French troops, inflicting heavy casualties while themselves suffering losses. But eventually the stronger numbers of French troops successfully encircled and closed in on the rebels. On May 21st, the rebels at Fort St. Charles were heavily bombarded by French cannons. The next day, the rebels left Fort St. Charles and divided into two groups. One was commanded by Delgray, and the other, led by Ignace. Ignace had his troops made a defensive position with a fortification, where, on May 25th in the Battle of Bainbridge, Ignace and his rebels were attacked by the French troops led by General Richepunce and his mulatto officer, Paillage. Supported by French artillery, the attackers win the day-long battle. Ignace refused to surrender and committed suicide, dying alongside 700 of his rebels killed during the vicious combat. On May 28th, Delgray and his group of 600 rebels, both men and women, were trapped on Busse-Terre, surrounded at the Dandelman plantation house by 1,800 French troops led by General Richepunce. Several hundred rebels choose to join Delgray in his suicidal plan to blow himself up under the plantation house when the French soldiers enter. There was an immense explosion, killing Delgray and hundreds of his freedom fighters and many French troops. The rebels had committed themselves to their oath, to live free or die. Following this spectacular and horrific ending, the French troops publicly mass executed dozens of rebels taken prisoner. On July 16, 1802, Napoleon prepared a decree that annulled the French Revolution's law of 1794, which had abolished slavery. Admiral Richepont at the same time re-established slavery on Guadeloupe, and put the past French Bourbon regime's racially prejudiced laws of the Code Noir, or the Black Code, back into effect. The last of the rebels were hunted down and purged from the island. An estimated 10,000 people of Guadeloupe were killed, deported, or fled as refugees. Going up until 1803, many local uprisings still continued against Napoleon's slave doctrine. Richepont died of yellow fever in September. As for the mulatto officer Pelash, who alongside some other black colonial troops fought against the rebels, he was sent back to France, where he was arrested briefly then released. He successfully petitioned to stay in the French army, and he became a very rare colored general in Napoleon's army. He was a brigade commander in Napoleon's invasion of Spain, which again aimed to crush the liberty of the local population. Pelash died in 1810. In the same year, the British captured Guadeloupe. The island was flipped about under the control of Sweden and France. In April 1848, slavery was finally abolished in the French Empire, and by May, a proclamation issued by the governor of Guadeloupe emancipated the remaining slaves.
The mulatresse Solitude was a mulatto woman who joined the resistance against the French troops' oppression in Guadeloupe. And she did so while she was pregnant. Solitude was eventually captured and stayed a prisoner of the French until she gave birth. The day after her baby was born, Napoleon's French soldiers took her away to be executed by hanging. Though her death was tragic and brutal, she became a heroic legend, symbolizing the epic story of Guadeloupe's freedom fighters, who stood firmly against systemic evil.